Hello everyone. Today's case will make your jaw drop as law enforcement destroys a family and a missing girl is still never found. Mistie Murray was born October 28th of 1978 in Nova Scotia to her mother Darlene Oldfield. In 1980, when Misty was around 2 years old, her mother would end up giving her up for adoption because she was living on the street at the time. Misty would end up spending a few years in foster care until around 1983 when she would be adopted by a couple named Anne and Steve Murray and their 2 sons. The little family would start off by living in Stratford, Ontario, but would eventually relocate to Goderich, a town 200 kilometers west of Toronto, founded by John Galt and William Tiger Dunlop of the Canada Company in 1827. Goderich sits along Lake Huron with a population of around 7,600 people. Now, Anne and Steve overall seem to be great people. Anne was an elementary school teacher, and I've seen different jobs that Steve did, such as being a truck driver. He also owned a pub in town. The family had a speedboat, and Steve had recently purchased a brand new Trans Am convertible car. Friends of Misty later saying, and I quote, "She loved her dad. When I talked to her, she was so proud of the new car her dad bought, and she was really talking a lot about it. She never talked bad about her mom or her dad." End quote. Misty was described as a friendly, outgoing child who was very popular at school but never a trouble at school. The Murrays would end up buying their new daughter a cat. They'd take her on vacations. And from all reports, they loved her very much and they treated her as part of their family. So much so that in 1994, Anne would end up helping Misty reconnect with her birth mother, Darlene, who turned out to live in Toronto. And Misty and her birth mother ended up developing a very close relationship, as far as even seeing each other at least every single month after they first met. In 1995, Misty was now 16 years old, and she actually made plans with her birth mother to take a trip to Halifax for a family reunion so that she could meet that side of her family. And she was even making plans to possibly spend the entire summer with her birth mother. However, as Misty got older, as some teens do, she began to rebel. Misty and her friend Danielle could often be found sitting at the pier eating fish and chips and watching the boats go through the harbor. They could also be found shooting pool, cruising the downtown, and window shopping. But it wasn't just that. Misty had also begun hanging out with a bad crowd who were doing drugs, they were skipping school, they were committing petty crimes. Danielle had also gotten pregnant and she was going to be a single mother soon. But her and Misty had made plans to graduate high school together, they wanted to eventually get an apartment together, and they wanted to go on to be career women. A week before Misty's disappearance, her parents would end up finding a note on their pillow that read, and I quote, "I'm sorry for what I have done to you in the past. I must admit, I have not been the greatest daughter to get along with. If I were you, a long time ago, I would have given up on me. But I know you love me, or else you would not have taken me in when I was young. Please forgive me. Signed, your daughter always and forever, Misty Nicole Murray." End quote. Now, this note wasn't very alarming to the Murrays because it seemed to be kind of a common occurrence that Misty would leave notes for them saying, "I love you," or "I'm sorry." But I think it is very interesting considering the time frame that this note was left. Now, as I said, around this time frame in 1995, Misty was now 16 years old, but she also had just recently met a new boyfriend who was older than her. He was reported to be around 18 years old, and his name was Jeremy Cook. Now, it turns out that Jeremy has been called her boyfriend. However, they had only met about 2 or so days prior to her disappearance. They'd actually met while her and Danielle were at a funeral for a fellow classmate who had died in a plane crash, and Danielle ended up introducing Misty to Jeremy. Despite just knowing Jeremy for a few days, Misty had already started calling him her boyfriend. On May 29th of 1995, Misty and Danielle spent the evening drinking and talking at Jeremy's apartment with him. That night, Danielle ended up leaving early because she said Jeremy was getting on her nerves because he was always bragging about drugs or his hunting knife collection, which reportedly made her feel uneasy. The next day, on May 30th, Danielle ended up calling Misty to arrange a meetup so that she could get back a pair of shorts that Misty had borrowed from her. Misty allegedly said during this phone call, and I quote, "Hurry up, there's someone I want you to meet," end quote. But it was not disclosed who this person was, and Danielle actually ended up not being able to end up meeting with Misty, so it's still very unclear who this mystery person was that Misty very eagerly wanted her best friend to meet. Reportedly, Misty ended up spending the rest of the day at Jeremy's apartment again, leaving around 5 p.m. May 31st of 1995 would be the last day that Misty would ever be seen. That day, Danielle ended up showing up at Misty's house to grab that pair of shorts. However, Misty wasn't home when she knocked on the door, and instead, Misty's mother, Anne, answered the door, asking Danielle why she wasn't at band practice. Danielle ended up lying, saying that she forgot it was band practice because she was actually supposed to be there with Misty. So she ended up covering for her friend and lying to Anne about it. It turns out that Misty had actually started lying to her parents about having to stay late at band practice so she could instead go hang out at Jeremy's apartment with him. Now, I've seen conflicting reports of when Misty or where Misty was last seen specifically. In all the early reports, Misty was reportedly last seen at her high school, which was Goddard District Collegiate Institute, while attending classes and visiting the nurse there that day. Although the reason for her visiting the nurse's office that day at school has never been disclosed. We do know, however, around 2:30 to 3 p.m., Misty ended up placing a phone call from her school to the elementary school where her mother worked. However, her mother didn't end up getting that call, and Misty never left a message. As far as I've seen, this was the last known communication that Misty had with her family. However, she also somehow told her parents that she was going to be staying late at school for band practice. And I've seen in later reports and articles, which I think was influenced possibly by something we're going to be talking about a little later. But in the later articles, it's referenced a lot that Misty was last seen at her home or leaving her home. However, again, I'm not sure which is the correct information per se, because I've seen both reported in news articles. What we do know, however, is that Misty would never return home on May 31st. She also had planned to go to a burger joint to have a farewell dinner with Danielle because they were both going to be having separate summer vacations that year away from each other. And so they wanted to have one last day to have dinner together, to chat, catch up before they weren't going to see each other for the rest of the summer. But again, Misty never showed up at that burger joint to have that dinner date. Misty not showing up to that dinner date made Danielle realize that something may be very wrong. So she actually ended up going over to the Murray's pub that they owned to apologize to Anne and Steve about lying to them about where Misty had been the night prior, because there actually turned out to be no band practice whatsoever that night. It was just a big cover-up so that she could go hang out with Jeremy. Now, Anne and Steve didn't seem to worry very much at first because they weren't surprised actually that Misty would lie to them about wanting to go see a boy she was crushing on. After all, they knew that she wouldn't run away because she had all these upcoming plans. She was extremely excited about going to Halifax with her birth mother and meeting the rest of her family that she'd never known. But they still wanted to do their due diligence, which is rightfully so. Go search for your daughter, figure out where she actually is. And so they started doing that by using Danielle as help. And the first stop they ended up making was at Jeremy's apartment, which Danielle took them to because she had been there before. However, when they arrived at Jeremy's apartment, he refused to let anyone inside of it. Not Misty's mother, not her father, not even Danielle, which Danielle found very weird because she had just been there a couple days prior with Misty while they were all hanging out. So why would it be an issue now? Jeremy so much so didn't want anyone going into his apartment that he even kept his foot behind the door so that the door couldn't even be pushed open at all. He was just basically, looking through a crack of it, which in my opinion is just very strange. You'd think that you'd want to cooperate the parents of this girl that is calling you her boyfriend. You guys are dating, allegedly, that you seem to be very close to, considering you just met her a few days prior, yet you don't want to cooperate at all. Very weird to me. Now, as these cases often go, Misty's disappearance has all of the red flags that we often talk about that something was very wrong. Misty had actually left behind her completely packed suitcase along with $200 on her dresser, along with dozens of photos, all stuff that, she had been planning to go on this trip with her birth mother to Halifax. And of course, police immediately thought that Misty most likely had run away. However, it was pressed how badly Misty wanted to go on this trip with her birth mother and to meet her family and to spend the summer with her birth mother and, getting to learn more about her history and her family members and where she came from. Again, so much so that she had packed her suitcase days early because she was actually supposed to leave a couple days after her disappearance. So it didn't make sense to anyone that Misty would just go off and run off somewhere, considering all of these plans that she was looking forward to. Everything was going very well for her at this point in her life, seemingly. She didn't seem to be upset about much, Of course, she had the normal teen angst, it seemed like, and she was making some bad decisions. She was lying, but she wasn't doing anything outrageously bad. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't, doing any hard drugs as far as anyone knew, to the point where she was putting herself in high-risk situations. And I know some people will argue, and I can understand it, that probably hanging out with a bad crowd, such as other kids doing drugs and committing petty crimes, probably is putting herself in high-risk situation. I could see that in a way, but considering all circumstances, Misty didn't seem to be that bad of a kid. She seemed to be a pretty good kid who was in a pretty loving family who went to such great lengths to even reconnect her, with her birth family, which not all, adoptive parents would do something like that. That has to be very hard for everyone involved, but it was something Misty really wanted, and they could see that and they understood that, so they did that for her, and she seemed to be extremely happy about the way things were moving in her life. And if she had, for whatever reason, decided to run off, even though they were allowing her to go on this trip for the whole summer, it seemed like, why wouldn't she have taken her suitcase that was packed, or even that $200 in cash, stuff that she would most likely need to survive? What's so strange about Misty's disappearance is that in the days following, there would be multiple sightings of her reported. On June 1st, a friend would report having spoken to her at a bargain shop in Goderich. By June 2nd, 3 teenagers who knew Misty reported seeing her walking along Highway 8 from Goderich to Clinton, which, as you can see here on the map, if she had walked, it would have taken her nearly 5 hours, which makes me wonder if she could have possibly hitchhiked if that was the case. On June 3rd, another teenager who knew Misty due to them being on the same marching band claimed that they seen Misty at the Clinton Fair while they were there, and she was wearing their marching band jacket, which is how they recognized her. Then over the next few weeks, there were as many as 20 other sightings of Misty, or someone that looked like Misty, in the city of London, Ontario, around the streets of Dundas and Glebe Street, hanging out with street kids that she was known to associate with there. But police did do some searching. There was said to be extensive air, water, and ground searches around the areas of Goderich within the month that Misty went missing. Firefighters, along with the Canadian Coast Guard, would end up searching Lake Huron. They'd also do ground searches around the area and the shores, hoping to find some kind of evidence. However, despite all of these searches, not one piece of evidence of Misty was found. And despite there being dozens and dozens and dozens of sightings allegedly of Misty, the OPP would come out to say that they believed that none of these sightings were credible and that Misty had not been seen after May 31st. And very quickly, police also began to think that Misty was a victim of foul play and that she had been killed very soon after her disappearance. Meanwhile, Misty's birth mother, Darlene, would walk the streets of London and Toronto with pictures of Misty, showing everyone she could find in hopes that someone would recognize her daughter and lead her to finding her. Now let's talk about Jeremy for a moment, because when Jeremy was asked about his last communications with Misty, he claimed he had last been with her on May 30th, so the day before her disappearance. His alibi for May 31st being that he was cashing a rent check. Despite that, according to police, his bank records would later show that he hadn't cashed that rent check until June 1st. Now, could that just be because a delay in the bank? You'd think if you went and walked into the bank, it would have been recorded that day that it was put in the bank, which would have been June 1st then. So what was he doing on May 31st then when Danielle thought, Misty was hanging out with Jeremy? Seemed like Misty was hanging out with him every single night and lying about it, so why wouldn't she have hung out with him that night? That's a big question. There was also allegedly reported sightings of Misty at Jeremy's house on May 31st and June 1st. But like all of these other sightings, none of them can be confirmed. Another young man ended up being absent from school that day that police would question. And this young man also was said to be uncooperative with police. Misty had also been complaining quite a bit before she disappeared about a very possessive ex-boyfriend that she had. However, despite some of these other leads or strange occurrences, police didn't consider any of these people suspects. But a police probe would end up leading to one of the last people you would ever want to be involved. Misty's father, Steve. 2 witnesses would end up coming forward to police claiming that they had witnessed Steve on his speedboat with Misty on May 31st, leaving Snug Harbor Marina and driving into Lake Huron. Now, there's a lot of issues with these witnesses, including that they hadn't been interviewed until 3 months after Misty's disappearance. These witnesses also allegedly had conflicting information regarding other sightings at the harbor that day. But this apparently is what led police to believe that Steve had killed his own daughter. By September 15th, Steve would end up being arrested and charged with second-degree murder of his daughter, Mistie Murray. The OPP claiming that Steve had taken Misty out on a speedboat onto Lake Huron, killed her, and dumped her into the deepest part of the lake. During the trial in 1997, the Crown failed to present any reasonable reason to why Steve would have even wanted to have killed his daughter. They also hadn't recovered any body, any murder weapon, or seemingly any evidence. The Crown claiming that Steve had dumped Misty into the deepest part of the lake, which is why they couldn't recover her body. It also seems like police had failed to acknowledge around 14 people who claimed that Steve actually was on shore at that point in time that day. A couple would also come forward named Joyce and Ross Carter, who claimed that around 7:15 p.m. they passed Steve while they were out on their boat. And according to the couple, only Steve was present on his boat. Misty was not there. However, it does seem like Steve was on his boat. That couple seen Steve on his boat. He allegedly did go out on his boat around 7 p.m. for about half an hour, allegedly. However, there seems to be this conflicting information whether Misty was on this boat or not, because now we have people saying she was, there's people saying she wasn't, there's people saying Steve wasn't even on his boat, he was on shore. Other people were saying yes, he was on his boat. But as I said, police had no evidence. They had no body, they had no murder weapon, and so within 43 minutes of the jury deliberating, they acquitted Steve. Steve was found not guilty. Despite this ruling, police believed that the jury was wrong. And so they continued saying that the jury was wrong and that Steve was guilty. And they continued to search Huron Lake, thinking that they were going to find Misty in there and be able to go back and charge Steve. Now, it does seem like Misty's birth mother, Darlene, was growing very close to the investigators during this time. She seemed to be of the assumption that Misty had been murdered as well, which honestly, I guess, what else could she believe at the time? From all accounts, Anne and Steve loved Misty. I've seen no reports where someone came forward where they said Misty confided in them that her adoptive parents were abusive to her or mean to her or this or that. She seemed to be very happy with her life. But here we have police still searching the lake with sonar, and they're not really looking into any other leads. They're not looking at any other suspects. They're just so zeroed in and focused on having to be right about Steve doing something here, even though they seem to have no evidence of it besides these two alleged witnesses that didn't even convince the jury. But I truly do feel for Misty's birth mother, Darlene. Like, imagine having just spent the last few months getting to know your daughter that you gave up for adoption when she was a baby. You're finally getting to know her. You have this big trip planned. You're going to spend the whole summer together and really get to know her and each other, you know, as adults now, essentially. I mean, Misty was 16. She wasn't technically an adult, but, you know, she's completely different than she was when she was 2 years old when you gave her up. And to just have all of that taken away from you in the blink of an eye, just days before you're supposed to have this great, fun trip together. I can't imagine what Darlene was going through as well. And then to see police are blaming the very people that you hoped and trusted would take care of her. That has to be very hard. Now, this initial police probe ended up being criticized by an independent review that determined that there were shortcomings and errors in judgment during the investigation, which you don't say. Now, it wasn't just the Crown, though. There was a lot of drama going on with this whole trial. In the aftermath, a key defense witness actually pled guilty to perjury, and she actually admitted to lying when she gave crucial evidence at the murder trial. She ended up testifying that she had been with Misty for 2 days and one night about a week after police theorized that Steve had killed his daughter. 2 other witnesses also ended up being charged with obstruction of justice over their sworn affidavits, who claimed to have saw Misty alive a week after her alleged murder. So this whole case was just a mess on both sides, truly. Despite being a free man, the trauma of being accused of murdering your own daughter never left Steve. A family friend saying, and I quote, "If we were having a family dinner or something, he wouldn't mention it. Even if you're not found guilty, you never get over something like that." End quote. Now, the witch hunt for Steve didn't just end there, because this entire thing ruined the family financially, which is something we don't often talk about. Just imagine the lawyer fees, the court fees, all of that occurred during this trial. On top of that, during the investigation, police would end up seizing Steve's prized speedboat because they claimed, you know, that he had taken Misty out on it and killed her on it. It was stated in news articles that police ended up taking out like the seat and different interiors, and they did all of this and took it to trial, but they didn't present any of it at trial. And not only that, they also just completely destroyed his boat during the long, year or so wait for the trial. The police didn't seem to preserve this boat very well, considering it was supposed to be evidence. They allegedly left it out in the rain and the snow. Because of all of the elements that it was left in, the boat got so bad that when it was given back to Steve, it was completely covered in black mold, and the water damage was so bad inside the boat that even the silverware that was said to be in the drawers of the little kitchen in the boat was completely rusted. In the end, even after trying to fix up the boat, it was sold at half its value. Steve also ended up having to sell his pub. In the end, Steve had to resort to putting ads in the paper to shovel driveways and sidewalks and clean mailboxes just to make ends meet. Not only was his daughter missing, but law enforcement seemed to have completely destroyed this man's life. Despite all of that, the OPP still believed that they had done nothing wrong whatsoever because they still believed that they were right. Retired OPP officer Wally Barker saying, and I quote, "I definitely wouldn't have charged him if I thought he wasn't guilty," end quote. Steve would go on to sue the OPP in a $100,000 lawsuit for destroying his boat, actually. However, I never found any conclusion whether he ended up winning that or not. In the year 2000, an age progression photo of Misty would end up being created to show how she'd look at age 22. And as the years went on, other age progression photos were also created. And her lawyer at the time would appeal to the public during a press conference in Goderich for anyone to come forward that had information. Also, openly calling out the OPP for ignoring 100 sightings of Misty within the year she disappeared. And Anne felt at this point like the police had abandoned Misty. She was angry, and she felt like Misty could have been found, but police essentially fumbled the case and were just so hell-bent on charging Steve for whatever reason that they had, I don't know what he did to piss them off or what the hell happened, what they had against him. Maybe it was just that they needed to just solve this so badly. They made a mistake and then didn't want to look bad, so they decided they couldn't go back on it and they could only look into Steve now because they'd screwed up so bad early on. I don't know. Either way, Anne was pissed because her daughter was still missing. Despite all of this, they went through a whole trial. Years had passed. It was going into a decade now. There was still not one bit of information on where the hell Misty was. Misty seemed to be forgotten in all of this, even though Misty was the one that was missing. It would also later be revealed that police had allegedly destroyed public calls to the Mistie Murray hotline reporting sightings of her, and saying in a Waterloo newspaper in 2001, and I quote, "I am saddened and frustrated. I have no idea why a police force would do this to a sightings of a child," end quote. A reward for $25,000 would also be put out around this time for any information that would lead to finding Misty. But sadly, it's nearly been 30 years at this point, and there are still no answers as to where Misty is and what happened to her. Darlene believed in 2003 that her daughter had been murdered shortly after her disappearance, saying to newspapers in 1997, and I quote, "She is gone. I don't know how, but to think she just disappeared from a small town with no trace and no proof she's out there. No way. She was high on life. She was so happy. But they believe she disappeared and is not dead. No way. She's gone." End quote. Which has to be such a hard conclusion to come to. As I said earlier, I feel so badly for Darlene, especially if she has nothing to do with this whatsoever. She just reconnected with her daughter, now she's gone. It's one of those things, if you want to look on the bright side, at least she did get to spend a little bit of time with her daughter before she did disappear, but no time would ever be enough. Now, Anne's initial theory was very much so different compared to Darlene's. In the initial, years after Misty disappeared, she more so seemed to think that Misty had been forcefully taken out of Goderich, and seemed to believe that Misty might have gotten addicted to crack cocaine or another drug and then possibly moved to Toronto with a pimp. After Steve had been exonerated, sex workers in London and Toronto told the family that they remembered a teen sex worker named Jean Marie who looked a lot like Misty. And that theory might have held some water, because 6 years after Misty's disappearance, a lead would end up sprouting up in Vancouver, of all places, on the complete other side of the country, of a young woman who looked strikingly like Misty, down to the same gap in her front teeth. 2 people would end up anonymously writing in after seeing Misty's missing persons flyer, claiming that they were 99% sure that they found Misty, because there was a woman in Vancouver who was using aliases who looked very much like Misty that would regularly access these services. The email was signed "To Concerned Citizens in Vancouver." Now, it's alleged that these 2 anonymous tipsters actually worked in one of the shelters in Vancouver, and they didn't want to come forward because they could get in trouble for disclosing private information at a shelter or something along those lines. But it was stated at the time that the woman in Vancouver was going by the alias Mallory, and she allegedly had no identification on her and refused to allow anyone to take her picture. Mallory allegedly told these social workers a lot of stories about her own background that exactly matched Misty's background and upbringing. Just like Misty, this woman claimed that she was born in Nova Scotia to a mother that ended up giving her up and that she spent time in foster care. But this woman also claimed she'd been living on the streets of Toronto since she was 14. When Mallory ended up being asked by a worker at Covenant House, which is a shelter in Vancouver, if she was Mistie Murray, Mallory became hysterical and allegedly fled and didn't show back up after this. Officers would eventually arrive at Anne's home geared with a photo of this Mallory person in Vancouver. I'm not sure how they got it or how it was obtained. And at first, when Anne seen this photo, she wanted to believe that it was Misty. However, as she stared at the photo more and more, she began to notice other characteristics on this girl's face that just didn't match Misty. Anne saying, and I quote, "It's the closest I could get to seeing Misty," end quote. Now, considering the time frame and the sightings of a girl matching Misty in Vancouver, there was a lot of talk about if it's possible that Misty was trafficked to Vancouver and then possibly could be a victim of Robert Pickton, because the time frame lines up. She might have been in Vancouver during that time frame then when Robert Pickton was, active and he was killing sex workers. However, there is absolutely no evidence to be found that links Misty to Robert Pickton at all. It's just a theory. And I think eventually Anne would admit that she did believe that Misty most likely had been killed. Anne and Steve would eventually divorce, and Steve would eventually relocate to Callander, Ontario, a small community outside of North Bay. However, on July 30th of 2018, Steve would end up dying in a work-related accident, never knowing what happened to his daughter. A missing kids caseworker saying, and I quote, "After more than 25 years, Misty's family still misses her. They remain hopeful that one day all the nightmare brought by her disappearance will end, and they find the answers they are looking for. Our hope is that anyone with information reports it now," end quote. Now let's talk about some theories. We've already kind of brought some stuff up throughout the video, such as police thinking Steve did something. We've talked about Robert Pickton. The hard part is that police seem to kind of quickly just think it was Steve, so that it doesn't seem like they did all that much investigating outside of that. There seems to be no evidence at all pointing anywhere, but there are hundreds of alleged sightings of Misty within, the days of her disappearance to years later. So could it be possible, like the theory Anne initially had, that Misty was, forced away? Maybe she was trafficked out. I guess it could be possible. Another big question I have is what Misty was talking to that nurse about at school before her disappearance, and why she needed to call her mother right after that. And the fact that that's never been revealed is strange to me. Then again, with Canadian cases, they hardly ever reveal anything. There's been a lot of chatter about whether Misty might have been pregnant, and I've seen a lot of people wonder if it was the boyfriend. However, when I found out that she'd only known him for a couple days, put two and two together, it's not really possible to find out, especially back in 1995, that you're pregnant 2 days after conceiving the baby. So I did see theories that possibly she had found out she was pregnant, and then she told Jeremy, and then Jeremy might have killed her because of that. But again, I don't think that's possible. They were only together for a few days before she disappeared. And it makes me also wonder as well, if police do know what she talked to the nurse about and it might have been a pregnancy, why police wouldn't use that against Steve at his trial by making up maybe a story that he'd essayed her and killed her because, she found out she was pregnant, bearing his child, yada, yada, yada. Considering how far police were going in this to accuse Steve, you think they'd pull something like that out of their sleeve if they had it. So it makes me believe that that also might not have been the case of why she was talking to the nurse, and that just might be a detail in here that means nothing. Maybe she just went to the nurse that day, she had a headache, that's it. But it does make me wonder, Jeremy was such a new person in her life. She was hanging out with him so much. She seemed to have fallen head over heels for him. The fact that she was calling him her boyfriend just, a day or so after meeting him. It makes me wonder if maybe Jeremy did have other sinister plans for her. Maybe he did do something to her, especially since he was so uncooperative right off the bat, it seems like. Also, why was he lying about when he last hung out with Misty? There's so many questions I have, and it truly makes me wonder why police didn't look into Jeremy more. Why the hell did they jump to her father when there's just so much inconsistency with Jeremy? But I guess if we want to look at all possibilities, could the sightings of Misty walking to Clinton be true? Could she have maybe decided she wanted to go to the fair before, going off for their summer plans? Maybe her friends hit her up and were like, hey, come hang out with us there. So maybe she tried to hitchhike to Clinton and maybe she got into the wrong person's car. It could be literally no one involved in the story and no one's looking at the person at all. Like they have no clue who this person is because maybe she simply was just hitchhiking and those sightings of her are true. I think there are so many possibilities in this case, honestly. The fact that there's so little information, but then we have all of these strange things in this case, like Jeremy and like all these sightings. Could they all be true? Or could some of this stuff just be inflated and it wasn't true? I don't know. But that's the hard thing about this case. We just don't know. There's just so much misinformation, it seems like, in it. And then police were just doing their own thing. And it's just a mess. This case is honestly such a mess. And again, the sad part is Misty is still missing. She seemed to have gotten so lost at the end of all of this, when the whole point of this was finding Misty. Anne has said that she wants Misty's picture to be circulated around the world. So if we can do a little bit of our own part to help in this, whether that be sharing her missing persons flyer, sharing out articles with her face, name, sharing out this video even. Hopefully one day her family can get answers, because her father's already passed. And if he 100% was not involved, that man also died not knowing what happened to his daughter. And that is awful. And then we have Anne and Darlene, both of them, not knowing what happened to their daughter. This case is just an awful mess. And at the end of the day, there's a family here that's hurting still. They still have no answers. It's been 30 years almost. And Misty is still missing. No one has any clue what happened to her. Could she be in that lake somewhere? Could she have been taken out of the province? Could she have been taken out of the country even? Or could she still be somewhere close to home and no one knows it? But what I do know is that this family deserves answers. So let's take one more good look at Misty. Misty is described as standing 5'4" tall, around 115 pounds, with hazel eyes and dark brown hair. She also has a space between her upper front 2 teeth and a mole on her right cheek. Misty was last seen wearing red shorts, black boots, and possibly a green jacket with her name on the left sleeve and a crest reading Seaforth Girls Trumpet Band. She was also known to wear rings on every one of her fingers. She also has 5 piercings in her right ear and 2 in her left, but she was not wearing earrings on her ears the last time she was seen. If you have any information regarding Misty's disappearance and where she may be, please contact the authorities. I'll have their contact information below. And do you have any details that I didn't mention in the video today that I didn't know about? Let's chat about it down below. I'll be down there chatting with you all about how you feel. And where do you sway in this? Do you think the police are somehow right in all of this? Or do you think they did something really bad here? Do you think they truly destroyed a family? And Misty was just lost in all this, and her killer was allowed to get away. My heart goes out to Misty's family and friends, and I truly hope you can get answers one day. And as always, I hope you'll stay safe out there, lock your windows and doors, and I hope to see you in the next video.